How does Christopher Nolan respond to film criticism? As you all know, Christopher Nolan is my favourite director working today, and during the build-up to the release of his new film Tenet, I'm going to be covering a range of various topics surrounding the director's filmography and his new project. But one video I've wanted to cover for a few years now is something that I find especially interesting about Nolan's career. To me and many others, he is a practical filmmaker, but also someone who responds to not just the critics, but also the audiences in today's filmic landscape. I'm going to primarily focus on his recent projects, including Interstellar and Dunkirk, while also bringing up previous films to give weight to my discussion. In particular, I will discuss how Nolan has practically, rather than verbally, responded to certain talking points that have been brought up about his films over time. This can also give us ideas on how he may or may not approach Tenet. Before I get into it, if you want to see any of my future videos on Christopher Nolan and Tenet, along with other content on movies and television shows such as DUNE and Westworld, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoy this video, remember to give it a like rating. Without further ado, let's dive into how Christopher Nolan responds to film criticism. Going back a few years now, I remember preparing to do a dissertation on Christopher Nolan's Interstellar, and in particular how his film is contrasted to the primary influence of it, which was Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. I wrote about how Interstellar was more concerned with how we, ourselves as humans, can lead ourselves forward into space, whereas 2001 has a concluding focus on how spiritual forces can help us to evolve. Now obviously 2001 can be interpreted in many different ways, and this is one of the main attracting points that the film has going for it, but the supernatural elements are things that Kubrick focuses more in regards to the singular film. Nolan really aimed in on the human spirit of Interstellar, and I thought this was a very brave approach, which to this day continues to grow on me. Before writing this dissertation, I consulted with my tutor for advice on the idea, and his response was that Nolan is a very cold filmmaker, and how I should maybe reapproach what I was thinking of discussing. At the time, this idea of Nolan being a cold filmmaker in his approach was one that was beginning to become popular amongst critics and some audiences. Now I think we as fans of Nolan can understand a majority of the response his films have gotten throughout his career have been very positive, but from time to time there is some really interesting pieces of criticism that arise. I think there was a tendency to focus on his filmmaking and how it portrays a very dark perspective to the topics he covers. Whether you're talking about the terrorism aspects to The Dark Knight, the mind and dream control in Inception, or even Dunkirk, which shows the main characters simply trying to survive and not coming out of the film victorious in the typical fashion. Regardless of this, I do think there is a clear portrayal from Nolan in regards to humanity. He deals with the troubled nature of protagonists, and although everyone is entitled to their own perspective when it comes to film criticism, Nolan has interestingly responded to these types of points. The argument of him being a cold filmmaker was perpetuated after the release of The Dark Knight Rises. He was at a point in his career where he was at the top of blockbuster filmmaking and being solidified into mainstream frameworks, which obviously led to more critical points being raised. But the question is, how does he respond? Well, going back to Interstellar, the film which followed The Dark Knight Rises, we got a very different approach. This was Nolan presenting a very emotional narrative, one that focused on a father and a daughter. Nolan very much put his own soul into this film and showed that regardless of Cooper and Murph never really reconnecting after their separation through the vast distances of space, they were in the end still connected through their emotion for one another. The bookcase scene in the finale very much highlights this. Cooper doesn't know if this is real or if Murph even understands that he's trying to save her, but the theme of love that Nolan emphasises on very much in Interstellar shows that their connection will always be there. Although Nolan still has cold elements to his filmmaking in Interstellar, the narrative and the characters' connection are very much the emotional pulls, which without wouldn't have made us care about the story nor the people we follow in the first place. He went from a concluding superhero epic in The Dark Knight Rises to an emotional portrayal of a father-daughter relationship across the vast distances of space and space travel. This once again highlights Nolan's continued understanding of the landscape in which he works in. He makes films that of course he enjoys to make, but also ones that the audience can relate to and interact with on a large scale. Another example is Dunkirk, which although is much more dramatic and tension-filled in its portrayal, it has some of the most human moments in a war film that I've ever seen, and it doesn't need graphic violence to show that. You have soldiers who don't know each other, soldiers that we don't even know the backstories for. But Nolan gets us to care about these individuals without giving us lectures from generals or politicians, but rather through the soldiers' survival. We see different groups of people come together just to simply survive. And by adding a true piece of history, which was general civilians travelling across the channel to save these soldiers, we get again, following on from Interstellar, moments of true human connection. Another piece of criticism which came up from this film was that Nolan didn't represent the French as much as he should have. I do argue this point because I think showing someone as heroic, whether that is through survival or victory, isn't about the amount of screen time they get. It's about their decisions and who they are as characters. In Dunkirk, the French soldier who is introduced to us at the beginning of the film ends up doing one of the most heroic acts in the film. He saves a majority of the main soldiers we follow by simply opening the door on the boat that was hit by a torpedo. Now obviously these soldiers, including Harry Styles' Alex, turn against him without knowing what he did earlier on in the film. Nolan essentially showed a silent hero along with referencing Commander Bolton at the end of the film, who was staying back for the French. Regardless of screen time, Nolan gave us a silent hero portrayal of the French, and when you notice these things it becomes more powerful. Without the French character doing this, the other characters wouldn't even be in the second or third act of the film. The rewatchability that Nolan creates is unparalleled in today's cinema. He challenges mainstream audiences' intelligence and gives them stories that relate to the time frame in which they release. The Dark Knight was a reaction to 9/11. All you have to do is look at the poster and that very much symbolises that horrible event. Interstellar was on space travel, and during the time it released we had a heightened discussion on our potential travel to Mars, even so far that Nolan's film was put in schools as part of science classes. And then as political and war tensions have seemed to escalate over the past few years, Nolan released Dunkirk, which also gives the odd Brexit sensibilities while watching it. He wrote and directed a film which was about people coming together, which we obviously need more of in today's world. To put it short, he releases films that the audience would want to see in that particular time frame. He connects with people who watch his films without verbally having to have a conversation on social media. So how does Christopher Nolan respond to film criticism? The answer is that he responds practically, by making more films. He doesn't respond to critics or audiences through verbal communication. He makes films that address these points in more subtle and noticeable ways. The debate on coldness was followed with two very human films in Interstellar and Dunkirk. Casting decisions like Heath Ledger and even Harry Styles didn't need his verbal opinion before production. We saw their performances and were ultimately surprised. Leading into Tenet, there have also been points that Nolan doesn't want to cast a protagonist of colour, and also that people would like to see him go back to a similar route that Inception took. Well, now he's releasing his mind-bending science fiction film Tenet, which has John David Washington playing the central role. He's famously said in interviews that he thinks that the worst part of making a film is talking to the media and interviewers, because he likes the audience to just see his films and make up their own opinions. He then responds to the reactions and adapts as he works on future projects. We'll have to see how Christopher Nolan continues to adapt in his future films, but I think from this discussion we can gather that he is a filmmaker that continues to fully understand the landscape in which he works in, and he has no fears of branching into unknown territory. As Tom Hardy quotes from Inception, "Don't be afraid to dream a little bigger, darling." I can't wait to see how he develops and evolves over the next decade, and just maybe we'll finally get to see him win that Best Director Oscar that he's been getting ever so closer to lifting. Let me know down below what you thought of my brief discussions surrounding this topic, and also leave a comment saying what you would add to how Nolan has responded to the industry in which he works in. For more in-depth videos on various movies and TV shows, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Again, if you enjoyed this video, remember to give it a like rating. I will be doing a Tenet video in the coming weeks, but if you have any other ideas and topics that you think I should cover, comment down below and I will definitely consider approaching them. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.